It started with a smile. Not a forced one. Not the kind you see when someone's pretending. No, this was the real thing. That magnetic, camera-ready grin Meghan Markle had perfected long before she ever became the Duchess of Sussex. She stood there at the closing ceremony of the 2025 Invictus Games, bathed in golden light, hand in hand with Prince Harry, thanking wounded veterans for their courage, their service, their inspiration. The cameras ate it up. The press, even the cynical ones, softened. For a moment, just a moment, it almost felt like redemption. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But what if that moment wasn't what it seemed? What if, behind that radiant smile, a storm was already brewing? One that would eventually pit Meghan Markle against the very heart of the Invictus Games themselves. And more importantly, what if the person who stood in her way wasn't a royal, wasn't a politician, wasn't even famous, but a woman most people had never heard of? Helen Halliwell. To the outside world, that name meant little. Just another civil servant. Quiet. Professional. Utterly unremarkable. But inside the war rooms of the Invictus Planning Committee, she was the firewall. And when Meghan Markle came calling, ambitious, poised, demanding, Helen did something few have dared to do in the past 6 years. She said no. Not with drama. Not with a press release. But with a refusal so immovable, so understated, it sent shockwaves through every hallway of the foundation. And the fallout hasn't stopped. So what really happened? What led to this high-stakes standoff between the Duchess of Sussex and the Invictus Games executive leadership? Why did Meghan want to become the co-host leader of the 2027 Games in Birmingham? And why was that request ultimately and unequivocally denied? Those are the surface questions. But the deeper questions, the ones that never make the headlines, are more uncomfortable. Why now? Why Meghan? And why, in a world obsessed with platforming celebrity influence, did one quiet woman draw the line? More importantly, what did that decision reveal? Because here's the thing. Meghan didn't just ask to help out. She wanted a title, a leadership role, co-host status. The kind of placement that reshapes the entire identity of a global event. She called it symbolic unity. Others called it something else entirely. A hostile takeover. Now, before we go further, let's be clear about something. This isn't another echo chamber where critics shout for clicks. This isn't about scandal for scandal's sake. The story you're about to hear is not about scandal. It's about control, about narrative, about power, and the cost of protecting something deeply sacred in a world addicted to branding. The Invictus Games were never supposed to be glamorous. They were born in pain, in broken bodies, in silent battles most people never see. And yet, that very silence, what made it sacred, became the thing some people saw as an opening. The opening for a different kind of battle. Because in late 2025, something shifted. Insiders say it began quietly. A few conversations. Friendly suggestions. Then came a formal proposal. Then a set of non-negotiable conditions. Before long, what began as a collaboration had mutated into a demand. A demand that Meghan Markle be made co-lead of the 2027 Birmingham Games. A role never before offered. Never before created. And that's where things began to fracture. It's easy to brush this off as just another Meghan versus the world story. But that would be lazy. This isn't about tabloid gossip or recycled outrage. This is about a pattern. A collision between two deeply different philosophies. One rooted in celebrity influence, the other in institutional protection. And it all came to a head in a quiet boardroom in London, where Helen Halliwell faced a choice. Protect the integrity of a global movement, or bend to the pressure of a brand. She chose the former. And in doing so, she lit a fuse. What followed was a cascading sequence of private tensions, public leaks, royal silence, internal backlash, and eventually, a rejection so final it made even Meghan's closest advisors fall silent. So here's what we're going to do. Over the next hour, we're going to walk you through everything, slowly, carefully. Not just what happened, but why it happened. Who stood up, who backed down, and who stayed quiet. We'll break down the private memos that were never meant to be seen. We'll bring you the stories from veterans who felt betrayed, the phone calls that went unanswered, the subtle revenge moves, and the question Meghan's team still can't answer. Why didn't it work? Because in Meghan's world, things usually do. She shows up. She wins the room. But this time, It unraveled. And the unraveling didn't start with a scandal. It started with a woman who doesn't do interviews. A woman whose name was never supposed to be on the front page. Helen Hellawell, CEO of the Invictus Games Foundation, veteran advocate, policy enforcer. A woman who's been called everything from the last adult in the room to an obstacle. But to those who know her, she's something else. She's the person who knows when a line has been crossed, even if no one else can see it. So how did we get here? To a point where the Duchess of Sussex, global icon, activist, media powerhouse, was not just turned down, but completely removed from planning materials, promotional campaigns, and executive roles? To a moment where whispers from royal aides say Buckingham Palace didn't lift a finger to help? To a future where Prince Harry may attend the games alone? The story is more complicated than finger-pointing. It's more human than clickbait headlines. It's about silence, loyalty, and something we rarely see in public life anymore, restraint. And if you think you know where this is headed, you probably don't. Because the deeper we looked, the stranger it got. And the more we learned, the more one uncomfortable truth kept surfacing. This wasn't about personalities. It was about principles. And in a world addicted to optics, that made it dangerous. So we're asking you to sit with this. To really watch, listen, and consider what happens when legacy, loyalty, and celebrity ambition collide, and what it says about who we protect and why. The Invictus Games are more than an event. They're a promise, a sacred one, to protect those who've already given everything, and to keep that promise unbroken. Someone had to say no, and that someone wasn't supposed to say anything at all. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Why Birmingham? Why this city, this moment, this games? What made Meghan Markle zero in on the 2027 Invictus Games like it was the crown jewel of her comeback? See, the thing about timing, especially in royal-adjacent circles, is that it's rarely a coincidence. It's not just dates and calendars. It's strategy. It's survival. And, sometimes, it's desperation dressed up as destiny. That's what makes Birmingham so fascinating. Because on paper, it makes perfect sense. The city has grit, history, and scars. It's working class. It's resilient. It's British without being posh. It's endured industrial collapse, terror attacks, austerity, and somehow, it keeps rebuilding itself. Much like the veterans the games were built to honor, Birmingham was supposed to be the perfect host. Not glamorous, but grounded. The kind of place where real stories matter. And in late 2025, those stories, those veterans, were supposed to be the focus. Until someone changed the script. Here's what we know. Shortly after the 2025 games wrapped in Vancouver, insiders say Meghan Markle's team made initial contact with senior Invictus organizers. That contact didn't come through official channels. It wasn't a proposal. Not yet. It was more of a suggestion, a feeler, that Meghan was very interested in being more involved in the next cycle. The timing raised eyebrows. Internally, most were still recovering from the logistical chaos of the Vancouver event. Quietly, some staff were exhausted. Others were frustrated. Funding gaps, venue issues, last-minute changes to the broadcast. It had been a success, but a bruising one. And that's when Meghan's interest began to materialize into something more tangible. An informal pitch, delivered, reportedly, via a mutual contact, outlined a vision. A new Invictus Games. Bigger, bolder, more accessible, more emotional. The phrase that kept repeating? Global storytelling for a new generation. At first, some were intrigued. Meghan had name recognition. She had media savvy. And, let's be honest, she had access to donors no one else could reach. Netflix, Spotify. Even after the fallouts, those relationships still carried weight. But as the conversations deepened, so did the concerns. Because Meghan's proposal wasn't just about helping promote the event. It was about redefining her role in it. She didn't want to support the games. She wanted to lead them. Co-host status. Shared billing with Helen Hellawell. Shared editorial authority over the ceremonies. Input into programming. Event design. Even, some claim, wardrobe decisions for presenters. It was, as one staffer put it, the boldest request we've ever received from someone not on the board. Still, Meghan's team wasn't bluffing. They came prepared, with a mock-up branding deck. It featured Meghan front and center in military-inspired neutrals, walking beside wheelchair athletes and military families. Tagline: From Healing to Hope. Invictus 2027. The colors were soft, earthy. The tone? Gentle, intimate, personal. Too personal, some felt. Because here's the part that wasn't in the deck. The quiet, unspoken implication. Meghan Markle needed Invictus more than Invictus needed Meghan. And that, right there, is where the fuse started to burn. Let's zoom out for a second. By 2026, Meghan's public image had become a case study in contradictions. One week, she was praised for advocating mental health awareness. The next, she was accused of distancing herself from veterans and charities she once aligned with. The Netflix docu-series came and went. The Spotify deal collapsed. Paparazzi caught her outside a California Whole Foods, looking tired, unstyled, alone. The power couple image she and Harry had built was fraying. And behind the scenes, insiders say she was looking for something different. A platform that wasn't Hollywood. Something less vulnerable to critics, but still global. Still grand. The Invictus Games ticked every box. Service, legacy, impact, optics. But here's the thing. Meghan had been part of Invictus before. She'd attended. She'd spoken. She'd filmed. She knew the environment. She knew the cameras. She knew the angles. What she didn't seem to understand, or chose not to, was the ethos. Because Invictus wasn't built for optics. It was built for scars. Scars that don't photograph well. Scars that don't trend on Twitter. Scars that, in many cases, aren't even visible. That's what Helen Hellawell had spent years protecting. And when the Birmingham bid was officially confirmed as the 2027 host, Helen made one thing quietly but unmistakably clear. This event would not be turned into anyone's redemption arc. Not hers, not Harry's, and certainly not Meghan's. But at that point, the wheels were already in motion. Meghan's advisors had reached out to Birmingham City Council members. They'd quietly contacted British press outlets with early interest. There were even whispers, unconfirmed but persistent, that her team had begun scouting venues for a possible parallel media experience during the games. Think pop-up interviews, empathy-focused workshops, lifestyle segments, all with Meghan at the center. So why Birmingham? Because it wasn't London. It wasn't saturated with legacy and politics. It was open, because it wasn't Los Angeles. It was raw, because it had enough muscle to matter, but just enough vulnerability to be reshaped. And, perhaps most importantly, it was Harry's territory. The games were his baby, and through him, Meghan believed she still had the access. But access, it turns out, isn't the same as authority, especially when someone else is already holding the keys. And that someone wasn't interested in compromise. Not this time. Because quietly, behind the scenes, Helen Hellawell had begun assembling her own team. Not a media team. Not a PR squad. A firewall. Internal policy experts. Ethics officers. Legal counsel. She knew what was coming. She didn't know when or how it would land. But she knew. And so did the veterans. You see, we don't talk about this part enough. The veterans weren't silent observers in this drama. They weren't just honored guests. They were the soul of Invictus. And many of them saw what was happening and didn't like it. Some were respectful, quiet. Others weren't. We spoke with one off the record. Former RAF, 2 tours in Afghanistan. Lost his right leg below the knee. He said, she was fine when she showed up the first time. But then she kept, because Meghan didn't have to ask for co-host status. She could have shown up, supported from the side, and still received praise. Still had cameras. Still made headlines. But that wasn't the point. The point was visibility. Title. Placement. The point was leading. And the thing about leadership is, it changes everything, including who gets left behind. By the time Meghan's formal proposal landed on Helen Hellawell's desk, complete with visuals, scheduling requests, and branding language, there was already tension in the air. And Helen, as always, responded without emotion. She didn't react. She reviewed. She read. She annotated. She highlighted. And then she placed it back in the folder. No notes. No rejection. Just silence. But it wasn't over. Not even close. Because when Helen didn't respond in the way Meghan's team expected, they did something bold. They skipped her. They went higher. Directly to the board. And that was the first real miscalculation. Because what they didn't know, what Meghan's inner circle failed to understand, is that Helen had already briefed the board. Quietly, thoroughly. She had shown them the signs. She had warned them of proposed narrative shifts. She had flagged the risks, ethical, financial, reputational. She wasn't defending her turf. She was defending the games. So when Meghan's team submitted the request formally, to the board, not to Helen, they were met with an unexpected wall of silence. Not defiance. Not outrage. Just stillness. And then, a one-line response. The request will be reviewed in accordance with existing governance structures. Corporate speak for, we see what you're doing, and we're not moving. But Meghan wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Because someone on the inside had started whispering back. And what those whispers revealed would reshape everything that came next.